Alright, welcome back to Flight Sim 2020, and in today's video, finally we have the long-awaited FS2Crew tutorial for the Fenix A320. So ever since I put out my first tutorial for the fly-by-wire, people have been asking for the PMDG and the Fenix. I did the PMDG 737 video a couple of months ago. I'll put a link to that up at the top for you now. And now it's finally time to cover the Fenix A320. If you don't know what FS2Crew is, FS2Crew is a third-party piece of software for Microsoft Flight Simulator that gives you a virtual first officer and cabin crew. Using voice recognition, you can give instructions to the first officer and the crew, and the first officer will run through checklists with you, and you will need to respond with voice appropriately to your first officer. If you do not want to use the voice recognition features, there is also the option for button control, where you use specific keys that you've assigned to trigger certain events throughout the flight. I find that having FS2Crew just makes flying complex airliners a little bit more immersive and possibly realistic, because obviously in reality something like the A320 is not designed to be flown single pilot, and you don't fly them on your own. They are always operated by crew. So as always, this video will be focusing on how to use FS2Crew for the Fenix A320. It won't be so much focused on how to actually use the aircraft and fly the aircraft. And just like the other FS2Crew tutorials that I've done, this video will be kind of split up into two sections. So to start off with, I'm going to go through and explain the new interface. Again, the new interface has been around for a while now, but if you came from FSX or P3D, it's very different to what the interface looked like in those sims. So the first section of the video will be dedicated to explaining the new interface. Then once we've been through the interface, I will take you from start to finish through a flight here from Port Elizabeth in South Africa over to Johannesburg or Tambo. Right, so that's the plan for what we'll be covering in this tutorial, and let's jump right in and start with the first thing which a viewer pointed out to me that I didn't explain in the other videos, and that's how to actually open FS2Crew. So it's really simple. There's two methods you can use. Number one, you can just run the program from the exe file or using the shortcut it creates on the desktop. The method which I think most people are probably going to use is if you have the FS2Crew command center running, you can always come up to the flight sim menu, and the command center exists over here. Open that up, and then it will list all the FS2Crew products. So obviously we want the Fenix A320, and we can hit launch, and that will then open up the FS2Crew interface. Okay, so once the interface is opened, you will get something that looks like this. And again, we're going to go through each of the features. Now we're going to start with the toolbar at the top, but before we do that, I actually want to jump quickly into the settings and point out one particular setting, and this is enable tooltips. By default, this might actually be turned off, but I highly recommend when you are first learning FS2Crew to come and turn this on, because what it means is if we close this, and we can actually do it with any of the settings in here as well, we'll look at that next. With the tooltips on, if you want to know what anything does in FS2Crew, all you have to do is mouse over it and it will tell you exactly what it does. So no longer do we have to read through a huge manual. All of the information is actually built into the interface itself. So with that turned on, let's go through each of the options in our toolbar. So the first one is just going to expand and shrink the FS2Crew menu, so you can just collapse that down and make it smaller. The next little cog is the config panel. So that's going to open up this guy with all of our settings, which we're going to come back to and go through in more detail. Then we have the checklist panel. If we click on this, it opens up the checklist for the aircraft in a browser. One thing that's never worked for me is it also opens up this second window, which I believe is supposed to load the checklist, but that's never worked for me. But I've never really worried about it because I use the checklists in the aircraft rather than in FS2Crew itself. Right, the next two options are going to be very important for you when you are learning FS2Crew. So the first one is the assist panels. That's these assists that you see underneath here. That just turns them on and off. You're definitely going to want to have them there, particularly when you first start with FS2Crew. Because what these assists do is they help to prompt you and guide you through the sequence that you follow in a normal flight. So under the checklist assist, it will give you a prompt at the correct stage of flight to say, this is the checklist you should be running now. So for example, if it pops up here with before start checklist, you know that you can call for the before start checklist, and that is probably the right time to do so. Okay, underneath that is the voice command assist, and this is going to give you a list of available voice commands. Once you've called for the checklist, any valid responses that you might use to respond to the first officer's challenge will also appear in this box. So when the first officer calls out something from the checklist, you can use one of the responses in that checklist assist box to respond to his challenge. So if you are wondering what the correct phrases are to use in response to the first officer, the checklist assist section is where you are going to look. Right, then the voice command assist likewise gives you a list of available voice commands for that stage of the flight. But these are commands that don't necessarily belong to a specific checklist. So it's normally commands like getting the first officer to set autopilot modes or turn lights on and off, raise the gear, set the flaps, that kind of thing. They don't actually belong to a checklist, but they're still voice commands that you need to give. Again, not all of these are essential. Some of them might be optional, but the voice command assist panel will prompt you throughout the flight on commands that you may want to issue. Then the third and final assist panel is the Captain Flows Assist panel. This is really useful because it tells you what tasks and flows you should be performing at that stage of the flight. So obviously your first officer is going to go through his flows and setting up the aircraft based on the functions that the first officer performs, but you as the captain obviously need to play your role as well, and the Captain Flows Assist will tell you what you should be performing at that stage. Okay, the next button on the toolbar is also going to be very useful when you first start learning FS2Crew. This is the Info Center panel, so if we click on that, it opens up the Info Center underneath. As the name kind of implies, the Info Center gives us a bit of information about the stage of flight that we're at, and we have access to a lot of other information with these little panels at the bottom. So we can go through to the checklist. It'll give you some general voice commands that you can use during the checklist. It also gives you a list of the checklists that you need to perform throughout the flight. And this is important because now with the FSX and P3D versions of FS2Crew, the checklist would only be triggered in a specific sequence. However, now checklists can be called for at any time of the flight, which it now mentions over there. So if you happen to forget which checklist is coming up next and you've missed the prompts in the assist panels, you can quickly reference here to see which checklist is the one that you need to call for next. There's also other information on voice commands that you can give to the first officer, voice commands that you can use to get the first officer to set the autopilot, and commands that you can give to purser. Underneath we have some information on the flows that the first officer will be performing. So if you want to check under a specific phase of flight what tasks the first officer will perform, you can do that by looking through the first officer flows over here. Then underneath we've got some more technical stuff. Overview just gives you some information about the software itself. For example, the fact that we are captain and pilot flying, and the simulated pilot is the first officer. We have some logs for what the software is doing, speech stats with some help if you're struggling to set up your voice recognition, because remember FS2Crew uses Microsoft's built-in voice recognition. So if you are having issues with that, you can come in here for some help with how to set that up, some links to the FS2Crew socials, and some more information about the software and the version that we are running. Okay, so let's close the information center and we'll continue through the toolbar. The next one is our button for Pushback Express. If you have FS2Crew's Pushback Express, you can launch it right here when you're ready to set up your pushback. Same thing with the next button. If you have RAS Pro, you can trigger that from here within the software. The next one is our briefing panel. So if we open that up, it allows us to set information for, in this case, our departure brief. Once we're up at cruise, this will change over to our arrival brief. And this is very important. You'll see as we go through the stage of flight that we set this up correctly because the first officer takes certain information from this. So for example, the fact that we've set config 2 as our takeoff flaps, the first officer knows once we've started up the engines, he is going to set the flaps to the position based on our departure brief. Similar thing with the runway. When we do the lineup check, he is going to call out the runway that we've assigned here. So it is important that when you go through the brief, even if you don't run the brief and have the virtual captain read through it, make sure you set up this information correctly so that the first officer sets things up properly. Okay, let's close the briefing panel. The next is our Preflight Events button. So this starts the whole sequence where the first officer will begin the sequence of a flight from the beginning. So for example, when we click this now, he's going to start with establishing power to the aircraft and then go through his pre-flight flows, go out and do the walk around, and so on through all the stages of the flight. Once you've clicked it, you will see a little timer that appears over there that tells you how much pre-flight time we have left. So when that timer reaches 0, we should have done everything and be ready to push and start. And also the timer triggers certain things to happen at certain points, like the fuel slip being brought, the passengers boarding, etc. If you feel like you are ahead of the time and you're just waiting for the time to tick down, you can click on the little timer to speed it up in 1 minute increments. If you are going to do that, I suggest that you do it slowly so that you don't end up skipping very quickly past important parts and you miss the prompts and end up leaving out checklists and things like that. So skip through it nice and slowly, because it is going to prompt certain things to happen based on the timing, which you may or may not need to respond to. The other thing you may notice with the timer is that when the first officer is busy doing something, the timer will be highlighted red and you cannot advance the time. And that's just to avoid having issues with maybe he's busy with a checklist and you try and fast forward through the time and it triggers another event that the first officer needs to deal with, and now there's a conflict because he's already busy with something. So if the first officer is busy with a flow or busy with a checklist, that will be highlighted red and you can click it, but it won't do anything. Okay, then we have the option to restart the speech recognition engine. Again, most of the time you're not going to use this unless you run into issues with the voice recognition where it gets stuck on a certain command or freezes for whatever reason. If you find that you just need to restart the voice engine rather than closing the software and opening it up again, you can restart the voice engine by clicking on that button there. Okay, the next one is the little headset icon that very simply toggles between the speaker and headset audio outputs. So when we jump back to the settings, you'll see you can configure separate audio devices for headset and speaker mode, and this is where you change between them. Right, the next one in the toolbar is the manual flow command selector. If we click on that, it actually gives us a drop down of all of the flows that the first officer performs throughout the flight. And if you want to, you can select one and you can click on the button to manually run that flow. Again, this is something that most of the time you probably aren't going to use because all of these flows will trigger automatically at certain points throughout the flight. But if you find a situation where you need to run a specific flow at a specific time, you can go and trigger that manually. Okay, the next button is very simple. It just hides the toolbar at the top. So again, saves a little bit of space. If you just want to have the assist panels visible, you can hide the entire toolbar and save a little bit of screen space. Then the next one is pretty cool. This pops up a QR code which you can scan with a smart device, and then you can actually control this panel from your smartphone or tablet. But very important to note is both devices must be on the same local network for that to work. And if you're having problems setting that up, you can always open up the setup guide here from the bottom. Okay, then we have the Killswitch. If FS2Crew completely freaks out or something gets stuck or a sound keeps looping over and over again, any weird anomalies like that, you can kill any active operation by clicking on the kill switch. Again, not something you're going to use very often, only that's basically your in case of emergency. You can terminate whatever FS2Crew is trying to do if it appears to have hung or be stuck on something. Then the next one is the pin button, and what this does, if it's highlighted in orange like mine is, it means that this window will always stay on top of any other windows. So if you deselect this, you might run into the issue where when we click on Flight Sim, the panel now disappears in the background. Okay, it's still there, we just have to tab to it, but having it pinned means it will always stay on top of any windows regardless of where we click. And then the last one is just to close the software. So when you're done with your flight, done with FS2Crew, you can go ahead and click the X to close it. Right, now we're going to go all the way back to the config and we're going to have a look at some of the settings here. Now, quick disclaimer, I'm not going to go through every single thing in detail because once again, you have the tooltips and a lot of them, particularly here in the flight options, are just personal choice. You know, whether you choose one or the other is not going to be a case of FS2Crew works or doesn't. It's just going to slightly change how things happen throughout the flight. but we are going to go through some of the more important things that are going to completely change your experience. So first things first, here under devices, this is where, like I mentioned before, you can set up separate speaker and headphone devices. You can choose where to route those, and then you can also see that we're currently set to speakers. We can change that here just like we could in the toolbar as well. If you want to check that that's working,
audio test complete.
Click on the audio test, make sure you can hear it, and make sure it's playing out of the output that you want it to come out of. If we flip this tab over here, with the volume sliders, we can change the volumes of things like PA announcements and the environmental sounds like the passengers boarding and things like that versus the voices of the actual crew. Okay, then next part that's very important is our interface method. So this is where we choose how we interact with FS2Crew. Voice control means we're using the speech recognition. Button control means you use 2 buttons on your keyboard or controller or joystick to trigger different events. Auto respond is one that I haven't really played with. That's something I plan to have a look at a bit more detail later on. In this tutorial, I'm going to be covering voice control because I think that's how most people use FS2Crew, and that's the one that I find the most immersive and the most rewarding. So that's what we're going to be covering today. If we are using voice control, we get another setting underneath, which is open microphone mode. If you used to FSX and P3D, open microphone mode was how those always worked. That means your microphone is always listening. And if you don't want it to listen, you can mute it by using some of the options underneath, which we'll go through next. If open mic mode is deselected, we get another push to talk button that we can assign, and you have to hold down that push to talk key in order to give commands to the first officer or to respond to checklist items. So this is kind of the same way that you talk to ATC. I prefer to use open microphone mode because I don't want to have to hold the key down every time I speak to the person who is essentially sitting next to me in the same cockpit. The only issue with open microphone mode is the fact that the software is always listening, so it means if you're talking, like I'm talking to you guys now, FS2Crew might be picking up some of the words and triggering erroneous commands. And so to get around that, we have the mute options, and you'll see that there's 2 of them. We get hard mute and soft mute. The difference is very simple. Hard mute is a toggle, so I've set my hard mute to X, which means if I press X, my mic will be muted. If I want to unmute it, I press X again. Soft mute is kind of just the opposite of our push to talk key. As long as you're holding the key down, then it's muted. When you let go, it's now unmuted. So soft key works nicely if you quickly just want to hold it down and actually verbalize your briefings. Or another one that could work quite nicely is if you fly on VATSIM, you could set your push to talk key for VATSIM and your soft mute key to be the same key, so that when you hold down to speak to a VATSIM controller, FS2Crew is automatically soft muted at the same time so that it doesn't pick up any triggers based on what you are saying to ATC on VATSIM. Then on the right hand side here, we have our main key and secondary key. If you're using button controls, you need to map both of those. And then finally going all the way back to the top left is we have toggle main panel. This guy here is the main panel. You can have a button just to toggle that on and off. If you don't have it pinned and you want it to disappear behind flight sim, you can use a button to bring it back rather than having to tab every time. Okay, the last thing we're going to look at for our keys here is how to assign them. Very, very simple. All we have to do is click on assignment, and this is just telling you that you need to have FS2Crew or flight sim in focus. You can't go click on a YouTube video or something else because then it's not going to detect the key. But because we're here in FS2Crew, this will work fine. And this might be a little bit confusing because most people are going to want to just click here and type it in, but we actually have to hit start scan, and it is now basically listening to all of our keys, and we can hit the one that we want to assign. It will then display the key that it's detected. And last step, don't forget to save that, and it's now updated that, and X will be our hard mute button. Right, if you are having issues with the voice recognition, you can go through the speech training over here. Particularly the first time you use an FS2Crew product, it doesn't really matter which one it is because they all obviously use the same speech recognition. But I highly recommend you going through the speech training for your first FS2Crew module because it's going to improve the accuracy of the voice commands by a lot. Then next to that, we have our Simbrief Pilot ID. And what this does is you plug in your Simbrief Pilot ID, obviously, and that allows FS2Crew to pull some information from your Simbrief flight plan already. So that gets loaded into the briefing area. Things like the runway that we're using for departure and arrival can automatically be pulled from Simbrief and saves us a little bit of work when we're setting up briefings. Okay, and then at the bottom of this panel, we have the main panel opacity. So you can see this one, the opacity is always 100%. But if you look at my main panel here, I've reduced the opacity a bit just so it blends in a little bit better with the background. That's completely up to you, and you set that with this slider. The other thing is the panel size. I've cranked this up quite big for the purpose of this tutorial. It makes things easier to read. When we actually jump into the flight, I'll scale this all the way down, but very simple. You scale the size of the panel and it changes the size. Coming all the way down to the bottom, a fantastic quality of life update. With a previous update, they introduced this feature where when you use the hard mute key, it actually gives you a beep. And I particularly, and a lot of people who commented on my videos, found that quite annoying. We now have the option to turn it off. I was never stressed. I said right from the first video that I did where it was beeping, I'm pretty sure FS2Crew will add in a button to turn that off, and we now have that. I suggest leaving that off unless you particularly want the beep so that you know that it's muted. Of course, you can always tell that it's muted because your little microphone lights up yellow, which we'll see just now as well. Okay, then another one I recommend having on is launch the command center when you start Windows. The command center needs to be running in order for you to be able to launch FS2Crew from your Flight Sim in-game menu. If the command center isn't running, you won't be able to launch it that way. You would actually have to go out of Flight Sim and launch the software separately. So I recommend having that on to make sure the command center is running as soon as your computer's on, and then once you're into your flight, you can launch FS2Crew from that menu. Okay, then you can change the delay. This is the amount of time that the first officer waits before reading the QNH. Again, not something I've ever really worried about. Leaving it on 10 seconds seems more than enough. If you're finding issues where he's reading it too soon, you can maybe come and change that, or if you want it to be longer, you can adjust that. Personally, for now, I've just left it on the default, and I haven't really found a reason to go and change that. Right, heading over to the top right-hand side, language options. These are essentially the accents for your captain, which is you. Now, in voice control, the only time we hear the captain's voice is when we play the briefings. If you're using button control, you will hear this captain's voice during the checklists as well. Of course, we hear the first officer all the time when he responds to our commands and when he reads out checklists, and the cabin crew when they give us information about the passengers starting and finishing boarding, etc. So you can go ahead and you'll see there's a list of synthesized voices and actual recorded human voices, and you can go ahead and choose the one that works for you based on your preference. Okay, again, I'm not going to go through every single one of the options that we have now, but I am going to point out some that are important. The first one is enable the first officer flows. If you turn this off, the first officer doesn't perform any of their flows. I haven't really found a situation where I've wanted to turn that off, because that's kind of the whole point of FS2Crew, so I would leave that on. Enable tooltips we've already been through. Then another one that I would probably leave on is disable first officer commands during checklists. That means while he's actually busy running a checklist, it stops searching for other commands so that you don't kind of trigger him to start something over or do something else in the middle of a checklist. Okay, then another very important one, disable gear flap and spoiler control. If this is ticked, the first officer will not set the flaps or the gear or the spoilers himself. You will have to do it manually. Even if you call for something like gear up, the first officer will respond but won't actually do anything. This feature is here if you have a hardware controller with discrete positions for gear, flaps, and spoilers, because that can cause a clash between the software and the hardware. If, for example, the first officer raises the gear in Flight Sim, but gear lever on your hardware is still down, that creates a clash, which is going to cause problems. So if you have a setup like that, you are going to need to select this so the first officer actually doesn't perform any of those functions, and you will simply need to move them on your hardware controller yourself at the appropriate time. If you don't have a controller with discrete positions, for example, on my HOTAS, I have incremental switches which allow me to bump the gear and flaps up and down, and they reset to a neutral position afterwards so it doesn't cause any conflicts. I can leave that and let the first officer do that. Okay, all of these underneath are going to be personal preference. depending on how you want to fly, or possibly depending on the airline that you're replicating. So for example, something like the start sequence, the Airbus default start sequence is 2 then 1. But like it says in the tooltip, a lot of companies use 1 then 2. If you want 1 then 2, then tick it. If you want 2 then 1, then deselect it. Similar concept with single engine taxi after landing. If you want a single engine taxi, select it. If you don't, then don't. So I'm not going to spend time reading through all of these. If you want to know exactly what it does, turn on your tooltips, mouse over it, and it will give you that information. Underneath, the boarding sounds, if you want the sounds of passengers getting on and off the plane, you can select that. If you select cabin boarding music, this has actually changed. It used to just be cabin sounds. They've now relabeled it to mean music. So I probably don't need to explain that that means music anymore. Something you need to be aware of though is you cannot have both. You can either have the sounds of the passengers or you can have the music. I have that deselected because I use Pack X, and that gives us the passenger boarding sounds. Right, if we go over here to our call sign, this ties into the feature where you can ask your first officer to communicate with ATC, but this does not interface with FlightSim's built-in ATC, and it does not interface with VATSIM as well. It's purely an aesthetic thing. If you do want to use that, you can choose the airline that you're flying for and give it a flight number, and that is then the call sign that the first officer will use when speaking to ATC. Then underneath we have the Preflight Events ground services. This allows you to select when you start pre-flight events which vehicles will actually be called up to the aircraft. Again, personal preference. I recommend turning off the fuel truck, because if the fuel truck is called, it will pop up with the FlightSim wait and balance menu, just so that I don't have to close that every time I start pre-flight events. Right, then underneath is all of our server options. Again, for most users, you are not going to have to touch anything there. I've never had to change any of them. I've left them as is. But if you do have a specific setup that requires you to change some of these options, you know where to find them. Okay, so that pretty much covers everything that we need to know about the interface for now. So what I'm going to do now is quickly prep my flight, and then we're going to run through a full flight from cold and dark all the way to shutdown using FS2Crew, and I will point out and explain a couple of important things along the way. Alright, so I've got my Simbrief flight plan all set up. We've reloaded the flight, and it's time to get going. So just to show you guys, I have my microphone hard muted. It lights up in yellow to let you know that it is muted. And I also mentioned before that to run the pre-flight events, we click over here. But we can actually now do it with a voice command as well, which is let's start setting up. So that's what we're going to do. Let's start setting up.
Roger.
Right, so that's going to get a few things happening. We'll see the door will open. And if we jump into the cockpit, the first officer will now have started setting up or doing his cockpit preparation. So we've got batteries on, external power. He's going to start powering up the aircraft. We've got a couple of things to do as well. So the first thing I'm going to do is come across here. So it says we need to do our overhead prep. We need to prep the MCDU and the FCU and the center console. But what I'm going to do first is load up our flight and then go ahead and do the weight and balance. So we should pull our flight directly from Simbrief. Cool, and we'll go across to the METAR for PE. Right, the wind has actually changed significantly, so we're probably going to change our departure runway. But let's get things loading up so long. So it should have taken this from Simbrief, which it has. That's all good. And we'll just do a quick load for this one so we don't have to spend a lot of time waiting for our passengers and fuel to load. Right. That's done. Let's go and complete our overhead prep, which we need to turn this guy on, and that's already set. He's doing those. Fuel pumps will do once the fuel is loaded. We need to turn on the nav lights, seatbelts, no smoking, and arm this guy. And then we can come down here and start getting into our MCDU. So let's pull the flight from Simbrief. And once the fuel is done, we can turn on the fuel pumps. Right, we might as well set this while we're waiting for that. And we are flying for lift today, and our call sign is 1324. Cost index is 11. We're going up to 350. Right, this we're going to have to set up our CG after the loading is complete. But from Simbrief, I can get our zero fuel weight of 62. And our block fuel is 8 tons. Right, then, departing from PE, we planned on 2.6, but now the wind has changed. So we're actually going to do 8. No star, sorry, no SID. But now we'll come in here and set up, we're arriving into 2-1 left. And we do have a star, which is Standerton 1 Delta. And we can insert that. Right, we'll wait for all of this to finish and then we can do performance calculations. Okay, while this is going on, our first officer is busy doing his cockpit prep, and then shortly he will step out to do the walk around. I'm going to dial this up to 35, and we can turn on constraints, not waypoint, constraint. The other thing I want to do is set this guy to auto.
I'm out for the walk around.
Right, there he goes for his walk around. We'll put in 1324, auto, 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 and set. Cool. Right, so we've been through that nice and quickly. We're kind of just waiting for our boarding to finish. But what we can do is go and check out our charts so long. Okay, so we'll pull up PE. And we want the ground chart, which is this one. So nice and simple for us today. So we're going to push and start to face left, which is southwest, and then we'll taxi. Very simple, alpha all the way, alpha 1. Okay, so that's nice and easy. Let's go back and just see how our boarding is going. Still got quite a few passengers to board, but fuel is done, so we can switch on the fuel pumps. Okay, so he's back from his walk around now, so the next thing we can do is the departure briefing. But before we do that, we need all of this to be done so we can get our performance calculations, because we need to fill that information into the briefing first. Okay, so boarding is complete. So let's finish off our performance calculations. So we need to put 31.2 in down here. So that's sorted. And then we need to go here. Right, so we're taking off runway 8. Surface is dry. Let's do config 2. This guy, let's sync that. Let's sync that. Okay, and we'll do our calculation.
Hi, the security and safety checks are all done. Are we good to start boarding?
Okay, so she's now asked us a question, and you'll see under the assist, we get the responses. Obviously, the departure brief is a separate thing, but underneath that we get affirmative, yes please, go for it, okay, and we can choose any one of those and they'll be valid. Go for it.
Okay.
Right, so nice and simple. When you're learning the interface, you just keep an eye on the assists here, and it'll let you know exactly what you can say and when you need to say it. Right, we are doing toga, so we don't have a flex temperature. 129 and then 41, 41, and 2/down 1. So 129, 141. And 0.2/down. I said down 1, it's 0.1 actually. And then no flex temp because we're doing toga. Right, now that we've done all of that, we can go ahead and run the briefing. Okay, so that's fine. Config 2. This needs to change because we're doing 08. And this is 129, 41, 41. Now I have realized one thing. Even if I delete this, it actually comes back. So I'm not sure how you're supposed to tell it that it's a toga takeoff, because we can't get rid of that flex temp. 29.1 is correct. Transition altitude 5,500. I don't think that's right. I think it's 8,000. Okay, so because we don't actually have a SID, I'm not sure, but I think we'll do 10,000. That's fine, that's all set. So you'll see he's going to say flex. But what if I say 0? Let's try that. If I close and open, does it? No, it goes back to 55. Okay, so I'm not sure at this stage how to tell it that it's a toga takeoff. Can we put in toga? No. So yeah, that's, I'm not 100% sure. Right, let's run the spree.
Are you ready for the departure brief? Go ahead.
Okay, the newest weather show good conditions. We'll plan to push and start for a 2-engine taxi. There are no hot spots along our taxi route. It will be a left side takeoff, and no need for radar today. We'll plan on a normal thrust takeoff. Prior to V1, for any master warning, engine fire or failure that will prevent the aircraft from flying safely, we'll abort and stop on the runway. After V1, we'll take it flying and deal with it in the air and plan to come back here. Any questions?
No questions.
Okay, that completes the brief.
Right, he's going to carry on with some cockpit prep. And I think what we're going to do so long is prep our pushback. So we need to face left. Right, so I'm just going to launch pushback. Right, so I have Pushback Express from FS2Crew, so I'm going to launch it through the toolbar here. Okay, so let's just get this sorted. That's pretty much bang on. So that's perfect, and we can hide that. Okay, let's do our cockpit prep checklist. Cockpit preparation checklist.
Gear pits and covers.
Removed.
Fuel quantity.
8020 kilograms.
Seat belts.
On.
Adheres.
Nav.
Barrow ref.
1012 set.
1012 set. Cockpit preparation checklist completed.
Okay, so that checklist is done. And now that we're simply waiting for FS2Crew, this is when I would go ahead and speed up the time. But you'll see I'm going to do it nice and slowly, because at some point it's going to trigger something like that, which we need to respond to. So we don't want to fly through that and miss things. Thank you.
No problem. Have a safe flight.
Right, now we need to do the before start checklist. But before we do that, we need to do things like beacons, arm the slides and all of that. And we can only do that once the passengers are finished boarding. So I'm going to slowly go through this again.
Ladies and gentlemen,
and then wait for them to let us know that boarding is
Hey guys,
complete.
all packs
There
are
we
on
go.
board. Are we clear to close?
Please make sure that your hand luggage doesn't block
Clear
the
to
aisles
close.
or exits by using
Thanks,
the
let me know
overhead
if you need
lockers or
anything.
the area
Okay,
under
so
the
now
seat
we're going to
in
go
front of
through
you.
what we're
Place
supposed to be doing,
items
which is
as
things
possible
like
underneath
beacon
the
lights.
seats in front of you.
So let's turn that on.
You can
No,
make the
not the
most of the available
strobes.
space by
Beacon.
putting the bags in the lockers sideways.
Windows and everything should be
Careful not to put
closed.
anything
So let's
heavy
come
in the
down here and
overhead
double
lockers,
check.
as these items could
Right,
fall
and they're
out
actually
when they
going
are
through the
reopened.
slides.
This
So
is
let's
for your
let them know that
safety
they can
and the safety of those
cross-check.
around you. Portable electronic equipment, such
Cabin
as
crew arm
games,
slides and
computing
cross-check.
word processing equipment, may interfere with the aircraft systems
Right,
and must be
thrust
switched
levers,
off during takeoff and
idle
landing.
and parking brake is
Portable
set,
telephones must
so we
be
can do the
switched off
before
for the
start
duration
checklist
of the
now.
flight. Please fasten
Before
your
start checklist.
seatbelt ready for departure
Parking
and make
brake.
yourself
Set.
comfortable.
Takeoff speeds and thrust.
Toga,
V1 129, VR 141, V2 141, flex temp 5 degrees. Windows,
closed,
beacon,
on,
before start checklist completed.
Okay, so you see he read back the 55-degree flex because even though I removed it, I'm not sure it's still picking that up. So we need to figure out how to tell it that we're doing a toga takeoff. Okay, the other thing I'm going to do now is ditch the external power and come here and get rid of the GPU. And we can also get rid of the chocks and cones. And then we'll let Pushback Express know that we're almost ready. Flight deck to ground.
Go ahead, flight deck.
We will be ready shortly.
Roger.
Okay, so that's going to connect the tug. And then it's just a case of starting engine 2 and then starting engine 1. Okay, so as soon as we're connected, we'll call for our pushback, and then we'll wait for them to let us know that we can start the engines, and then we'll fire those up. Flight deck to ground.
Go ahead, flight deck.
We are ready for pushback and engine start.
Roger. Release the parking brakes, please.
Brakes released.
Pushing back.
Are we cleared to start engines 1 and 2?
You are cleared for high niggy. Start your engines at your discretion.
Starting engine 2.
Okay.
Pushback complete. Set parking brakes, please.
Brakes set.
Roger. Okay, the tow bar is disconnected and the equipment is clear. We will see you on the right with the pin.
Cleared to disconnect.
Thanks. Have a good flight. See you later.
Starting engine 1.
Okay.
Okay, so you'll see Pushback Express automatically closes once it's done. And now we're just waiting for engine 1 to finish stabilizing, and then you can see next up is the after takeoff checklist. But when we set the engine mode to normal, that's actually going to trigger the first officer to go through his after start flow, and we'll get some instructions for our after start flow to go and shut down the APU and things like that. Once we've completed both flows, we'll go through the checklist. Yeah, so we're just waiting to see available over there, which we have. Cool, engine 1 stable. Let's flip that switch. And you'll see the first officer has now gone into his flow and he's setting things like flaps and spoilers. We need to do engine mode selector normal, which we've done. APU bleed off. Anti-ice is not required. APU master off. ECAM status checked. And you can see now that the first officer is done because the flow has disappeared from over there. So let's call for the checklist. After start checklist.
Anti-ice.
Off.
ECAM status.
Check.
Pitch trim.
Set and checked.
Rudder trim.
Neutral.
After start checklist completed.
Clear left side.
Clear right side.
Okay, now we can go ahead and start our taxi out. Okay, we do need to perform the brake check. Brake check.
Pressure 0.
Flight controls check.
Ready. Full up. Full down. Neutral. Full left. Full right. Neutral. Full left. Full right. Neutral.
Taxi checklist.
Flight controls.
Checked.
Checked. Flap setting.
Config 2.
Config 2. Radar and predictive wind shear system.
On and auto.
Engine mode selector.
Normal.
ECAM memo.
Takeoff no blue. Takeoff no blue.
Ladies
Taxi
and gentlemen,
checklist completed.
all portable electronic equipment and mobile phones should be switched off as we are now about to start our pre-flight safety briefing. We are now going to take you through our safety procedures and equipment. As this information is for your benefit, we ask you to watch and listen carefully. The safety card in your seat area shows details of escape routes, oxygen masks and life jackets. It also shows the bracing position which you must adopt in an emergency landing. On the main deck there are 2 exits at the rear of the first class cabin and 2 at the front and rear of each other cabin. On the upper deck there is an emergency exit on each side in the middle of the cabin. In the unlikely event of having to use the escape slide, leave all hand baggage behind and remove high-heeled shoes as they may tear the slide. Please now ensure that your table is folded away, your seat back is upright with the armrest down and your seat belt fastened. The seat belt is fastened and adjusted like this, and unfastened like this. When the fasten seatbelt signs are on, you must go back to your seat and fasten your seatbelt securely. For your own comfort and safety, we recommend you keep your seatbelt fastened at all times and visible to avoid being disturbed in flight. If the cabin air supplies fail, oxygen will be provided. Masks like this will appear automatically. Stay in your seat and pull a mask towards you. This will open your oxygen supply. Place the mask over your mouth and nose like this and breathe normally, adjusting the band to secure it. Do make sure your own mask is fitted before helping anyone else. Your life jacket is underneath or beside your seat. In the event of landing on water, remove the life jacket from its container and pull it over your head. Pass the tapes round your waist and tie them securely in a double bow at the side. To inflate, pull the red toggle as shown.
Okay, so now that we're coming up to the runway,
the mouthpiece. There is a
Let's
whistle here
do
for
our
attracting
runway entry
attention.
procedure.
Do not inflate your
Cleared
life
for
jacket
departure.
until you are outside the aircraft. We will supply
Takeoff
life
runway
clocks for
confirmed.
babies and life jackets for
Approach path,
infants.
clear of traffic.
Finally, ladies and gentlemen, please study the safety card and take notice of the fasten seatbelt sign. May we remind you that electrical portable items such as games, computing and word processing equipment may interfere with the aircraft systems and must be switched off during takeoff and landing. Portable telephones must be switched off while the aircraft engines are running.
Lineup
As this is
checklist.
a no smoking service, the no smoking sign
Takeoff
will remain
runway.
on for the duration of the flight. Smoking is not
08
permitted at any
confirmed.
time whilst on board.
Runway
If you have any
8
questions,
confirmed.
please ask one of the crew.
TCAS.
Thank you.
TARA.
Packs 1 and 2.
Or
Lineup checklist completed.
takeoff.
Check.
Man Toga SRS runway auto thrust blue.
Checked. Thrust set. ...100 knots. V1. Rotate. Positive climb.
Gear up.
Gear up.
Autopilot 1 on. Flaps 1.
Speed checked. Flaps 1.
Flap 0.
Speed checked. Flap 0.
Okay, so there we go. We've got the first officer to sort out the gear and flaps and stuff for us. Right, there is our... Oh, I didn't actually change it in the MCDU to 10,000, so that's why it's doing that. So let's just pull standard. And now it's pretty much just a case of climbing up to our cruise altitude and cruising all the way onto Joburg. So the first officer will set the lights at 10,000 feet automatically. But we have to give him the instruction to do the seat belts. So here we come up to 10,000 feet, and that's what we're going to do. Okay, so that's him turning off the landing lights. And there we have the voice commands to clear RadNav, turn the seatbelts off and set standard. Clear RadNav.
Okay.
Seatbelts off. Set standard.
Standard cross-checked. Passing flight level 114.
Okay, so he's just going to confirm.
Now.
Right, so that's done. Okay, so now it's just a case of cruising onto Joburg, and I will join you guys again when it is time to start prepping for our descent. Alright, so we're coming up to our top of descent shortly, so we need to start prepping. You have control?
I have control.
Okay, so we're going to hand over control to the first officer so that we can look at our tablet and stuff and do some calculations. So runway is dry. We're doing 2-1 left. Let's put in the METAR. Landing weight, I guess we can overestimate by taking our weight at the moment, I suppose, 65,900. Okay, so we'll do auto brake low. Reverse, that's all cool. Alright, so we can set that guy. And we can also just come up here and check. Okay, transition altitude is 8,000 and our intercept altitude is 8,000 as well. So we'll dial this down to 8,000. Right, then we can come across here. Weather's good, runway's dry, it's an ILS, not an auto land. Transition level is 8,000. And then our decision height will 200 feet. And that's checked, so let's run that briefing.
Are you ready for the arrival brief?
Go ahead.
Our current weather shows nice VFR conditions, and we've got the arrival and approach for guidance in FMS for descent planning to get down to the airport. It'll be an ILS approach. The runway is dry, and we take the first available turn and taxi to the gate per ATC instructions. Once cleared, we can plan to start the APU for taxi. Any questions?
No questions.
Brief complete.
Okay, then the other thing that we need to do is just go back here. Okay, QNH 1020. Temperature is 17. And then it is 240 at 7. And 200 feet, and that's correct. I have control.
You have control.
Right, so we've got a little bit more time to go. And once we reach our top of descent, we will engage our managed descent. What I do want to do is turn up these lights because it is starting to get a bit dark. Alright, so we're pretty much at our top of descent now. If we go down here, it'll tell us we're actually 2 miles away, so let's start our managed descent into Joburg. Okay, so we're just passing through 10,000 feet, and now we need to start getting configured for our approach and landing. Flaps 1.
Speed checked. Flaps 1.
Arm approach. Gear down.
Gear down. One 018 set, passing 7,500.
2,500.
Flaps 2.
Speed checked. Radio altimeter alive. Flaps 2. Now.
Flaps 3.
Speed checked. Flaps 3.
Approach checklist.
Barrow ref.
1020 set.
1020 set.
Flaps full. Set and check.
Minimum.
Set and checked.
Auto brake.
Arm.
Engine mode selector.
Normal.
Approach checklist completed.
Flaps full.
Speed checked. Flaps full.
Landing checklist.
ECAM memo.
Landing no blue.
Landing checklist completed.
Right, so then
1,000.
we've been through all of our procedures to get configured. Now it's just a case of putting it down on the runway and
1,000.
taxiing into the Charlie gates.
$500. $100 above.
100 above.
Minimum
Minimums
Continue.
checked.
100. 50. 40. 30. 20. Retard. 5. Retard.
Spoilers. No reverse engine 1 and engine 2. Decel. $70 knots.
Okay, now that we've exited the runway here, all we have to do is disarm the spoilers, and that triggers the first officer's after landing flow.
Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the captain and the entire crew, we'd like to welcome you
Okay,
to
we
our
need to
destination.
do...
For your
Okay, no, it's
safety,
actually done
please remain
everything, so
seated with
that's
your
cool.
seatbelt fastened, leaving all items of hand luggage safely stowed until the seatbelt signs have been switched off. Before you leave the aircraft, please ensure you have all your personal items and hand luggage with you. Please be careful when opening overhead lockers, as items may fall out, causing injury. We'd like
After
to remind
landing
you that
checklist.
smoking is not permitted until
Radar
you
and
reach the
protective
designated
windshield
smoking
system.
area.
Off.
After landing
If you require
checklist
assistance
completed.
when you leave the aircraft, please contact a member of our ground staff. If you're
Right,
connected
now we
to
just have
another
to
flight
taxi
today
all
and
the
hold
way
a boarding card and
to
transfer wallet
the
advising
Charlie
you
apron.
of your departure terminal, please follow the signs to flight connections. This will lead you on to your departure terminal, and please check your gate number in the departure lounge. To avoid missing your onward flight, we strongly recommend that you go straight to your departure terminal. For those of you who do not have a boarding card, please go directly to the flight connections desk. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the entire airline, thank you very much for choosing to fly with us today, and we hope to see you again in the near future. Thank you.
Okay, so coming up to the gate now. Taxi light off. Oh cool, we actually have a marshaller, which is awesome. Okay, parking brake is set. And now we can go ahead and shut down the engines. And we will flip over to the APU because our first officer has already started that. Okay, let's come down here and go to the door page. Cool, they're disarming, and we can turn off the beacon light and the seatbelt signs. Right, and they can start deboarding. Right, and then we just do the parking and secure list. Cabin crew, just arm slides and cross check. Parking checklist.
Parking brake or chocks.
Set.
Engines.
Off.
Wing lights.
Off.
Fuel pumps.
Off.
Parking checklist completed.
Securing the aircraft checklist.
Oxygen.
Off.
Are you sure about that? Emergency exit lights.
Off.
EFBs.
Off.
Batteries.
Off.
Securing the aircraft checklist completed.
Right, I'm not sure why it hasn't actually switched off. It's quite interesting. But anyway, that is the full process. So you'll see we now get the trigger again to start setting up from scratch. But yeah, everything should have switched off. If the APU is still running, that's probably why. Even though I've shut it down, if we go here, yeah, APU is still on. Interesting. Anyway, that's a problem for another video. Alright, but that's going to bring us to the end of this tutorial video on FS2Crew for the Fenix A320. If you found it useful, you know what to do down below, and I will see you in the next one.